All right, joining us now, we've got NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hillyard, CNBC global supply chain reporter Lori Ann LaRocco, Senior Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Shannon O'Neil, and New York Times White House correspondent Tyler Page. He's also the author of the book 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and the Democrats Lost America, which is out July 8th. All right, Vaughn, I want to start with you. Have we had any reaction from the White House to the reaction from China and this new 125% tariff?
Caroline Levitt was asked just a few moments ago specifically whether President Trump would pick up the phone call to call Xi Jinping and begin these negotiations or begin a stand-down effort on the tit-for-tat tariffs. And while she skirted that direct question, there is no apparent conversations or dialogue happening between China and the U.S. at this time. But she said that she was optimistic that China would understand that they need the U.S. economy and they need to maintain their relations with America, and that ultimately that they would come and find a way to strike a deal. Of course, during Trump's first administration, negotiations for a phase one deal took almost 2 years. And the question here is, with tariffs now at 145% on Chinese goods coming into the United States and now 125% tariffs on U.S. goods going into China, you're talking about sky-high tariffs, which Chinese officials suggested overnight amounts to a near standstill of trading relations between the two nations, that these tariffs could not stand to go any higher, yet they have maintained that they are not going to back down. And so the question here is, will the United States begin to initiate that dialogue with China, or are we looking at a prolonged back and forth at a time that clearly the markets have suggested that simply 90-day pause for the other countries' trading partners, that the China trade war is still of top concern here for investors at home?
And you heard the president in that long cabinet meeting yesterday say he wants to make a deal with China. He thinks he can make a deal with China. This does not seem to be going in the deal direction. Lori Ann, I want to ask you about this phrase from that statement out of Beijing that U.S. goods would be no longer commercially viable. What does that mean, and how big a deal is that?
It's a huge deal. I mean, as you know, with the first trade war, agriculture has always been the crosshairs. But China showed the world that they didn't need U.S. soybeans. They actually started farming soybeans in Russia. In addition to this, in addition to the soybeans and other agriculture, you're looking at pharmaceuticals, electronics, oil, gas, and coal. And those are going to be slapped with the 125% tariff. And that effectively means that we're out of business there.
And Shannon, on that note, President Xi issued kind of a warning today in lieu of a direct phone call leader to leader with President Trump, saying, quote, there are no winners in a trade war, and going against the world will only lead to self-isolation. On Friday, according to CCTV's China state broadcaster, that's where this came out. He also said for over 70 years, China's development has relied on self-reliance and hard work, never on handouts from others, and it is not afraid of any unjust suppression. That kind of seems to me like she's saying if it's a battle of whose population is going to be willing to endure economic hardship, come at us. What does that statement say to you, Shannon?
Yeah, those are fighting words, I would say, right? This isn't making of a deal. And what I would say is since the last set of Trump tariffs that began in 2018, that then became Biden tariffs, that we have seen China systematically try to change and diversify its trading partners. So we have seen a big shift. So they trade more today with Southeast Asia than they do with the United States. They trade more with lots of other emerging markets than they do with the United States and Europe. So we've seen them begin to move away from the U.S. And while this will hit China hard, right? They send $460 billion worth of goods to the United States each year, which, will fall down dramatically. They have been moving to other markets. And as they've moved into other markets and expanded their presence there, they've also expanded their presence in global trade. So they are making moves already to delink themselves from the United States. And this will be really a break.
And Tyler, what policy options are left for the Trump administration if they want to keep this going? China has said, we're not going any further on this. I've seen conversations that maybe the U.S. could kick China off of the international banking system. Is that realistic? Where do you think it goes from here?
I think it's hard to predict exactly what Donald Trump will do next. As we've seen over the past several weeks, he's said a lot about what he wanted to do on tariffs, and we've seen what he's actually done change quite a bit over the course of the implementation process here. But it is clear that the undergirding, the idea that is undergirding this trade war is to try to isolate China. One of the ways that his advisors, as my colleagues and I reported in the New York Times, got him to back down from these reciprocal tariffs was to make this more about isolating China from the rest of the world. And one of the things I've heard from sources is that the Trump administration was growing increasingly concerned that Japan and South Korea were looking at becoming more aligned with China as it related to responding to these tariffs. That was a cause for concern within the Trump administration. So we know that the president is very focused on trying to win this quote unquote trade war with China as it stands right now. What other options he may take? Clearly, there are a lot of things in the toolkit for the U.S. to deploy, but it's hard to predict exactly what direction this will go. And I think it's also important to remember that what impacts this has on the rest of the market and the global economy will be key here. Obviously, one of the things about China is they have a lot of investments in the U.S. Treasury bond. That is something that we saw spooked the president and his economic advisors as we saw that sharp sell-off earlier in the week. So it's another thing to keep an eye on is how these tariffs and the escalation impact the broader economic market.
And Vaughn, President Trump did appear to feel pressure from Wall Street ahead of the 90-day pause. You heard Tyler just talk about kind of the international aspect of that. There was that rather unprecedented meeting between economic ministers from China and Japan and South Korea. But is there any amount of voter pressure he may feel on this specific issue that could change his mind about tariffs on China?
Right. We have seen in initial polling that when it comes to his handling of the economy, we have seen a majority of Americans disapprove of his agenda. At the same time, I mean, in so many ways, this echoes what he endured through his first administration. And there was much scrutiny. Some of his most loyal supporters, particularly in the agricultural industry, were the ones that were on the front lines of bearing the brunt of the financial losses caused by the trade war with China. And yet, the administration backfilled a great amount of their losses with ultimately $28 billion in financial relief payments to farmers across the country. And I think that is where you continue to hear from Americans on the ground. There is a desire and a hope that they believe in the long run that he will ultimately be able to put some trade deals together and that the U.S. will benefit from these efforts. So right now, there is no consequence that we see, at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's not consternation about some of those financial losses mounting again and an increase in consumer goods. So for the president right now, he believes of the decade that he's been in power, that he is able to make a pitch to the American public that these battles are worth waging and that dominance over China is a fight worth having. And it's going to be seen over the course of these months ahead if, in fact, he holds his ground, whether the American public at large sticks by his side.
But Tyler, when it comes to messaging, has the president left himself any room to maneuver when it comes to the China issue? You've highlighted the change around the narratives before the 90-day pause from the initial claim that, this was always the plan, as we heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, to Trump directly referencing market volatility just a day later and even saying, he saw Jamie Dimon talking about this on TV. But it's more complicated with China because if China doesn't back down, do you think the president and the White House can figure out a way to make a deal that the U.S. would have to start capitulating on, or is that just off the table for this president?
I mean, one of the things that we've come to know about Donald Trump is that he's always trying to look for a deal and is able to spin it in the favor that he wants to. And he will find a willing audience in the Republican Party in Washington and throughout the country, often willing to fall in line and support whatever sort of messaging tactic he decides to do. We saw that with some of the Republican critics of his trade policy so far, very quickly falling in line and saying that it was brilliant maneuvering and, quoting from his book, The Art of the Deal, after he backed off some of the reciprocal tariffs. So I think the messaging is less of the concern for the president than it is the implementation and the impacts on Americans across the country. We're already seeing some members of Congress grow concerned about the impacts this economic situation could have as we move closer to the 2026 midterms. I know we just finished the November elections, but already those are underway with primary fights and eventually a contested race for the House and for some of these tight Senate races. So I think it's really going to be, as Vaughn was saying, as the months go by and this trade war really starts to hit Americans' bottom line, that's where we might see the president start to feel some real pressure. But so far, he has had a greater appetite for risk when it comes to markets than I think a lot of even some of his supporters anticipated.
Tyler, it is a Friday at the end of a very long week. I am not ready to hear the word election right now. It's okay. Shannon, but I want to talk to you about the flip side of this, because the impact on China, despite Xi saying, he's not afraid, a full-blown trade war with the U.S. means being shut out of the world's biggest consumer market. The Chinese economy is tailored to sell cheap goods to China. So is it possible that with enough prolonged pressure, we actually see China blink and come to the negotiating table?
Definitely going to hit the Chinese economy. And already they were having serious domestic problems in the real estate markets with their own domestic consumption. And we've seen over the last year a huge surge of exports out to the world precisely to revive the Chinese economy or give it sort of a boost. So this cuts out one of its biggest markets. But as I said before, China has started to move away from the United States as its main source or location for where it sends its goods. It started to focus on other markets. And I do think we will see it double down on that, looking at all kinds of markets around the world, whether that's the European Union, whether that's Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, other places. They will double down on those efforts. Now, they won't be able to make up for the U.S. market, assuming these tariffs stay there. It will be a big hit to China. But we also there have a political system that is all aligned behind Xi. So he does have the flexibility and the ability to handle the political pain. He, unlike the Republican